Hey everybody, wake up. This is Wake Up with Mark Joyner, episode number 87. And today we will discuss the double-edged sword of certainty. Are you certain? People ask you that all the time. Are you certain? Can you really be certain about anything? Well, if you look at it the way I look at it, through the lens of utilitarian model flexibility, that is, every model of the universe, every way of being is neither right nor wrong. It just has more or less utility, more or less usefulness, depending on what you want to accomplish in life. It is a stance, by the way, which frees your mind to a great extent. It allows you to no longer be stuck in a particular mode of thinking, all right, which can be very dangerous. We'll talk about that here in a second. Certainty can be useful sometimes, and it can also be quite dangerous. If you are using it in an offensive way, right? Now I'm using offensive, in a very loose metaphorical sense here, all right? If you were trying to persuade someone of anything, I would call that an offensive use of epistemology, right? Not that it would offend anyone necessarily, but you are attacking someone else's belief system sometimes. This is what marketing is, guys. This is what propaganda is. This is what all persuasion is. You are attacking someone's belief system. If you think it's anything other than that, you're fooling yourself. All right? That's the reality of it. If you are engaged in that, that is what you are doing. Now, are you doing it for someone's benefit is the question you should be asking yourself. Or are you not concerned with their benefit? Are you only doing it so that you can get some benefit, regardless of what the outcome is for them? That's a very important question you should be asking yourself. But that's not the topic for today. The topic for today is how this notion of certainty is a double-edged sword. If you are using it offensively, it is very, very powerful. Why? People are not certain about what's going on around them. They can't be. I don't think we are wired for certainty. We don't have the bandwidth for certainty. So what do? We look for shortcuts. We try to find other people around us. This is one of the most useful shortcuts. Through conformity and obedience to authority, right? These are two very, very well-established, well-observed phenomena in the psychological literature. People tend to believe what other people around them believe. They tend to conform their beliefs to those beliefs. And they also tend to conform their beliefs to the beliefs of authority figures. Or not necessarily the beliefs, at least the statements of authority figures. Sometimes authority figures believe one thing and state something else, and then they get you to believe this other thing. That happens all the time. If you don't think it does, you're fooling yourself. Wake up, pay attention. They don't necessarily have your best interest in mind. Why is this so effective? It's because of that uncertainty that we are born with, more or less. So we have to, because we don't have the capacity to understand everything going on around us, we must use shortcuts to come to conclusions. Two of those most popular shortcuts are conformity to a group behavior and obedience to authority. There are many, many others. Cialdini, in the beginning of his book Influence, said that he was talking about shortcuts. But he's not telling the whole story there, because really what he's doing is he is echoing models of persuasion that already exist. He didn't invent these. Okay? No offense to Cialdini. He's a great, great scholar and has made huge contributions. But I believe in putting credit where credit is due. Okay, this has already been spoken about by the heuristic systemic model and the elaboration likelihood model. They both have that same model of persuasion. So when you come to people and you are certain about things, people will be attracted to you. Think about it. If you were watching an advertisement of a guy who's like, well, I'm not really sure if this works or not. It seemed to be okay when I tried it, and some people tried it and they liked it. Who knows, maybe it will work for you. Would you be very inspired to buy from that guy? Of course you wouldn't. Of course you wouldn't, right? Think about it. Now, if, however, that same guy came to you and he said, and he was exuding certainty, he had all of this evidence, and no matter what you said, he was unshakable, you would find that very charismatic. You would be attracted to that because you're like, well, how else is this person so certain? They must have done their homework. They must have done their research. Now, the problem with this is, as followers, as humans who are trying to find the truth, whatever that actually is, when we have certainty about particular beliefs, we close ourselves off from evidence to the contrary. This is the definition of confirmation bias. We begin to look for evidence to support those beliefs rather than take in other evidence that might negate it. Now, I get into discussions with people about diet all the time, and I do this on purpose. Why do I post questions about diet and about politics? Is it because I want to stir up trouble? Is it because I'm trying to get a lot of exposure by starting a fight on the internet? No. If my aim was to get people listening to me, I would take a very, very different approach. When I post questions like that, I am trying to trigger people into thinking. I'm trying to expose them to counterpoints of view so that they might loosen up their positions a little bit. Let's take diet. I see a lot of people who are super, super certain that diet X, Y, or Z is the only right diet for humanity. And all of them present very compelling cases. Guys, I've been down all these rabbit holes myself. Okay, I was, for a while there, convinced that the vegan dogma was that was the truth. I watched all the documentaries. I read all the books. I took a dive into the literature. I read the China study. Okay, I probably understand it deeper than most of the vegans do because I actually tried to understand the data. But over time, some things happened. One is I started to have negative effects from the vegan diet for my health. Two was, as I started to dive into the literature a little bit, I started to see potential flaws in the literature. The vegans will tell you that the literature is unequivocal, that it's irrefutable, but that there is a settled science case. And by the way, there's no such thing as settled science. Anybody who tells you the phrase settled science, I'm sorry, they have disqualified themselves epistemologically. You are not qualified to have that conversation if you believe settled science exists. Why? Because it's completely contra to the spirit of science itself. Science is remaining open. It's making observations. It's formulating hypotheses. It's gaining greater and greater degrees of certainty about those hypotheses, but it is never closed off from the possibility that it might be wrong, that it might not be looking at the whole picture. For example, we used to think that the periodic table of the elements was all there was in the world of chemistry. But now with the nanomaterial revolution, we know that behind the periodic table, there's another periodic table and another one and another one and another one. Okay, that's when we were so certain about that was everything, and you've got so many, chauvinistic scientific bigots out there who are like, oh, we've got it all figured out. And then you present new evidence to them. You take those things and compare those things. When you see that guy who's really, really certain, who's like, no, this is reality. These are scientific laws. Therefore, they are not to be questioned. They are called laws for a reason. There's no way to disprove them. But then you take that same guy, you juxtapose that with a little bit later, us discovering contexts where these things are not true. The laws of physics, for example, we know that there are contexts in which the laws of physics do not apply. At least the Newtonian laws of motion. We know that at a subatomic level, they do not apply. So how certain are you of things? How certain are you? If we can't be certain of the Newtonian laws of physics when we discover contexts in which they are no longer true, or if we discover that the periodic table, it turns out, was only a tiny fraction of what's going on physically in the chemical realm, And if you don't believe this, by the way, Google graphene, if you haven't heard me talk about that before. That is about one of the examples of the things going on in the nanomaterial revolution. If that's the case, how can you possibly believe your dogma about diet? How can you believe that carnivore is the only way, or that veganism is the only way? Do you really have enough data to support that? Now, if you look into the vegan literature, for example, you see a lot of evidence out there that says that, hey, people who are eating, a meat diet were getting sick. But what they didn't control for were what are known as confounding variables. These are variables that they did not pull out or add in to see whether or not those variables were the actual cause. And if you can't identify those things, you are going to, by definition, have a fuzzy result. One of the things that most of this literature does not control for is the quality of the meat. Was the meat grass-fed or grain-fed? Was it from a fast food source injected with all kinds of hormones, or was it naturally grown? The biological effect of these things, it seems, is going to be radically different. So if you have people eating McDonald's, and that's your example of your meat eater study, well, of course you're going to get a result that is going to support the notion that eating meat is bad. Look into the vegan literature. You're going to find tons of examples like that. And by the way, can we ever control for all of the confounding variables? Well, think about that. Can we do that when we can't actually know what all of the variables are? When we just discovered that even chemistry is but a tiny sliver of the reality of what's going on out there in the chemical world, what we perceive to be everything was but a tiny sliver. When we discover that, how can you tell me that you've controlled for all of the confounding variables? That's basically saying that you are omniscient, meaning you know everything, that you have all of the variables, that you've identified all of the variables. I'm sorry, I call bullshit. You haven't. You haven't. Unless it's just now, finally, we have the answer, because it seems that every time we come up with a conclusion like this, we always have this level of certainty. This is it. We discovered this new thing. Now we understand. It would seem to me that there's the possibility that perhaps there are other variables here that you haven't yet accounted for, that the world hasn't even discovered yet. How certain are you feeling? How certain are you feeling? So be very careful of certainty in your own thinking, but use it as a weapon to persuade other people. Why? Because they are going to resonate with that. They are going to be charismatically drawn to your certainty. It works in social situations. It works in marketing. It works in all forms of persuasion. People are drawn to those who are certain. But use that very carefully, guys, because if you are going out there and you are using certainty as a weapon to persuade people to believe certain things that we can't necessarily be confident about, you're doing harm to society. But if you are using your certainty and your confidence to get those who want to follow you to have more confidence in the project that you're working on, I don't see any problem with that, because you've got to give it your best shot. Otherwise, how are you going to know whether or not it's going to work? If you're going to use it to persuade your family or potential lovers, right, to be more attracted to you, that to me is all fair game, as long as you are not corrupting the data set in their head. Okay, but if you can exude the certainty that you have inside you whatever it's going to take to get the job done, if you can exude the certainty that, hey, you know what, maybe I'll experience setbacks, but I will get my ass back up and fight, I can guarantee you that. If that's the kind of certainty you're exuding, I think that's a healthy thing. I think that's a good thing. I think people are going to be drawn to that. And notice the difference. You're exuding certainty about something inside you as opposed to certainty about things about which we have no business being certain. Okay? We don't have any business being certain about diet, guys. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. If you really look into the literature, I think you're going to find that to be true. And if you juxtapose this with the history of science about how everything is constantly evolving and about how we keep discovering more and more layers of complexity to this whole picture. For example, another example is what we discovered about the microbiome. It's possible that when people have individual differences in the microbiome, diet A and diet B are going to have radically different effects on those people. And we don't know how to change the microbiome yet. Taking probiotics is not going to have a huge impact on your microbiome. The only thing we know, and you're going to get grossed out when I tell you this, but the only relatively reliable way that we've been able to adjust the microbiome on people has been through something called fecal transplantation. And even that is rather uncertain. You can Google that if you want to find out what it is. It's gross, but it's a valid therapeutic protocol. But what that tells me is that the microbiome is extremely complex. It's still totally unknown. I mean, we know it a lot better now than we did 20 years ago. About 20 years ago, we used to think that there were only about 30 or so species of bacteria and fungi that are meant to live in your gut. Now we've identified tens of thousands of species. And we're finding correlations. We know that, for example, I believe if you have more of a concentration of firmicutes, I think, which is one of the families of bacteria that live in your gut, you're going to be more likely to be obese. That's one of the interesting observations people are making. Is that a hard and fast rule? How can we know? How can we know? Maybe there are still more extenuating circumstances, more confounding variables that we have not yet identified. So if you come at me and you write under this that you've got all this evidence, and by the way, I've even had to block some people, because they're so certain about their outcome and they won't listen to any information or evidence to the contrary, and they're going to be insulting and rude to people who question it. For example, I was just a couple days ago, someone compared me to being a flat earther because I questioned whether or not veganism was settled science. Yes, I have failed to stay up with the times, right? It was a rather absurd comparison. People like that, you got to be very, very careful about them because they will corrupt your data set. Know what you can know and be very careful about what you choose to believe, okay? And be flexible about what you can believe. Use it as a tool, guys, because if you are walking around the world with certainty about one particular belief or another, understand that you are walking around with a mental handicap that is going to prevent you from seeing the full picture. All right, guys, that's it for today. You have a beautiful day, and I'll talk to you all